2003. I'm at the New Hampshire Veterans Home, and as part of our participation in the Veterans History Project, I'm speaking this morning with Richard Ducey, who is currently a resident of Center Barnstead, New Hampshire, and a longtime supporter of the New Hampshire Veterans Home. And Rick would like to share his story with us, and I'm going to allow Rick to begin with an introduction. He served during Vietnam, and Rick, could you start by telling us where you were living before you enlisted?
I grew up and enlisted from Chester, New Hampshire. It's a small town in southern New Hampshire, and that was at a time where all of the kids that I grew up with enlisted. In fact, there were no individuals in town that were even drafted. We'd grown up with a generation of parents who had all served in World War II, and it was what you were expected to do. It didn't seem like any kind of unreasonable sacrifice or anything at the time. It just seemed like what we were supposed to do.
So how old were you when you enlisted then?
I turned 18 on a Sunday, and I enlisted on a Monday on a delayed entry program. Frankly, I thought that I'd enjoy the summer off before I went in, because I knew that the way the war in Vietnam was going, I would probably end up going over there and wanted to have that summer to enjoy. So I actually went in the military, took basic training in the fall of 1967 down in Fort Knox, Kentucky.
And so how was training? What was that like, getting there, your first few days experience? Was it tough?
Well, it was interesting. I went with another fella from Chester, and we actually went through basic training together. Most of the rest of the basic training company was what they call a block draft from Memphis, Tennessee. The vast majority of the company that we were in came from Memphis. They were about 50% black and 50% white. They'd grown up on opposite sides of the city. There was a great deal of stress or strain between the two groups that the other fellow from Chester and I just looked at and didn't really understand. One of the things about the military was that it was a real cultural awareness. If you grew up in a small rural New Hampshire town in the 60s, I'd never seen a black person or any person of color. It was old Yankees. We were the minority in town because we were French Canadian. You know, in those days, that was what a minority meant to me. The fellow that I went in with is the postmaster down in Chester now, and he likes to tell a story about when we got to Cleveland. We made a plane change, and in the Cleveland airport, they had an escalator. I'd never seen an escalator in my life. He had to actually come and get me because I kept riding up and look at the moving stairs, and I kept riding up and down the stairs. I think everybody that's ever worked in the post office in Chester has heard the story, and to say that we were naive is kind of an understatement. Things back in those days were much simpler, and we led a pretty protected life, even though we didn't really appreciate it at the time. I've gotten together with some of the fellas that I grew up with within the last couple of years. We and our wives, our children are all grown now, and we go out to dinner probably once a month. And one night we were talking about what a great town it was to grow up in, what a great era it was. We had a lot of fun. Some of the pranks that we pulled as teenagers, they'd probably call a SWAT team about now. Everybody is so much more politically correct and filled with anxiety about anything and everything. The town clerk back in those days was Miss Richardson, and you could go to her with a bill of sale for a car written on a brown paper lunch bag, and she'd register it for you. And insurance wasn't even required on a car back in those days. If we put a new motor in the car, we'd try it out before we put the exhaust system on up and down the main street. The chief of police happened to catch us, he'd tell us to get home and put the rest of that thing back together. But it was real different. Everybody knew everybody else, and times were a lot slower and a lot simpler.
Right.
That's the good side. The bad side, of course, is that back in those days, women made about 45 cents on the dollar for doing the same job as a man. as far as our society, we were racist. There were things that we were not aware of that when I came back and went to college in the 70s, I was very much a part of that change. And there were some things that were good old days, and there are some things that were not unless you were white and middle class.
So coming from that small rural town, New Hampshire background that you come from, what were your first days like when you finished basic and landed in Vietnam?
Well, after basic, we had another 8 weeks of training. And then I had 17 days leave and went to Vietnam. When I arrived in Vietnam, I just found this out recently. I was reading something. The week that I arrived in Vietnam was the highest casualty totals at any time during the war.
When was that?
That was May of 1968.
Okay.
The Tet Offensive had just finished. I was surprised that the highest casualty rates were not from the Tet Offensive, but apparently towards the end of it there was a lot of activity going on, and we had become very aggressive at that point after Tet in really hunting out the enemy, and it resulted in a lot of casualties. My brother was there when I got there. He had joined the Army in 1966, had served 18 months in Germany, and then was shipped to Vietnam. He was a minesweeper in Vietnam with the 1st Infantry Division, and we actually saw each other a number of times. He was an older brother, and the first time I met him, he suggested that I go home. They couldn't make two brothers serve at the same time in a combat zone because of the Sullivan brothers in World War II. My attitude was, you've been here 6 months, you go home. And his attitude was, I was always kind of out of the 4 boys in my family, the one that was more of a bookworm kind of kid. And he suggested that I wasn't going to be able to talk my way out of getting hurt over there, and that I really needed to get on a plane and get home. I didn't realize at the time what a sage piece of advice it was, but we saw each other frequently during the last 6 months of his first tour of duty. He did a second one, and the first 6 months of mine.
But he made it home okay
Yes,
after
he
his
did.
second tour.
Yes, he
He
did.
did?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we thought we were okay at the time. Both he and I had cancer from our exposure to Agent Orange. And he had a pretty rough time coming home, like a lot of other veterans did. In some ways, I was lucky. After 11 months in country, I was wounded. And I spent almost a year and a half in Army and Veterans Administration hospitals. And it really provided a decompression chamber. A lot of veterans were in the bush one day and 48 hours later watching the war on television in their homes. And they didn't have any kind of decompression time at all. And it was really difficult to go from one scenario to another that rapidly. And I think it caused a lot of problems with a lot of the vets. That, and quite frankly, the response that we got when we came home, especially after 1968.
Sure. So during that time that you were in Vietnam, where did you first serve? Your first few months in Vietnam, what were you doing? What were your job responsibilities?
I was an infrared equipment specialist, and the equipment that we used then was very primitive. It was mostly left over from World War II, nothing like what they have today, and there was very little of it. Our first platoon was assigned to different companies of the 1st Infantry Division, and in 2 to 4 man teams. After my brother left, I was transferred up to the 25th Infantry Division and served primarily with one unit up there, which was Delta Company, the 2nd of the 27th Infantry, with the 25th Division. We were working up along the Cambodian border. The 1st and 25th Divisions basically shared the same area of operations. It was called 3 Corps, 3rd Corps Tactical Zone, and was the area from Saigon east towards the ocean and west to the Cambodian border. It went to the south as far as the edge of the Mekong Delta, and as far north